Thank you. I was very honored to be invited. Honored and a little bit surprised because I am not a computational linguist. So none of my slides will have any, oh there we go, any numbers on them. You'll have to go somewhere else to get your numbers today. This is a huge topic. It is very hard to compress it into an hour, so it's going to be a very general overview of historical lexicographical processes and how we have adapted. So there's no question that the internet and digital culture have changed lexicography, but the way that that change gets pressed out is not linear. It involves a lot of approximation. I'm going to use Merriam-Webster as a case study. Merriam-Webster is the largest commercial dictionary publisher in America. We've been around for a little less than 200 years. That is not very impressive to anyone who does European lexicography, but that's very impressive to Americans. I want to focus on three primary areas of practical lexicography, both historically and how they're changing, and then I want to move into some broader philosophical considerations that lexicographers need to keep in mind as we move into the digital age. So, the first area of innovation and adaptation is in collecting the raw materials for the dictionary. Now, the lexicographical tradition that I come out of has focused primarily on writing monolingual English dictionaries written for native speakers of English. We have not had in America a robust ELL publishing tradition, nor have we had much of a bilingual tradition. So all of our processes are geared for this, monolingual English dictionaries for native speakers. Historically, the raw materials have been collected through reading programs. The OED, as far as I can reckon, is the first group to have used a formalized and crowdsourced reading program. It was established in the mid-1800s. It relied primarily on educated lay people who were instructed on how to read sources, usually the ones that interested them, though some were solicited, and mark those sources to add words to files. Merriam-Webster followed suit in the mid-1800s, but instead of using lay people, we used editors, and that sort of set up the paradigm for how Americans collected their raw materials. American Heritage has instituted a program, Webster's New World, and so on. So in short, the reading program became the industry standard through the 19th and 20th centuries for finding your raw materials. Now, we tend to think of these programs as static because they involve static paper. They're not, they're very dynamic. The curation of sources was always being tweaked. James Murray, who is the editor of the OED, found that as the work on his dictionary began, that there was a substantial gap in where the citations were pulled from. Specifically, he said in an appeal that he put out, that's at the top, that the 18th century citations were not covered very well. They had not covered sources from the 18th century. So he began issuing public appeals for readers. Merriam-Webster took some heat in the 1960s when it published Webster's third New International Dictionary. That dictionary was seen as incredibly permissive. It was controversial for lots of different reasons. It was not incredibly permissive, but that was the view. And the view was not helped by the fact that it tended to pull a lot of illustrative quotations from sources of questionable literary merit, including, most famously, the memoir of Polly Adler, who was an infamous brothel keeper in New York in the 20th century. This was horrifying to anyone with taste and culture. It's not many of us in America, but that's okay. This is part of the design of the third. Down at the bottom here, if you can see it, is a section from what we call our black books. That is the style guide at Merriam-Webster. It's called the black books because they were all mimeographed, single-typed pieces of paper held in black cloth binders. And this is a section from our marking instructions for editors. It covers non-standard words. It starts, many common non-standard words and phrases are poorly represented in the files. This was true. And it goes on to say, all such non-standard words and phrases that are met in general reading should be recorded for consideration in the third edition. And so they were, and so they have been. Now, of course, English prose has, for the last 15 years, been increasingly moving online. We have fewer and fewer print sources to read. And as it's moved online, it's become digitally sorted into databases and corpora. And this has presented the practical lexicographer with some very uncomfortable truths about how citations are collected. The first is that online sources are not generally edited. And at Merriam-Webster and among most traditional lexicography houses, you give preference to edited sources. Traditionally, we believe that an editor brings to a work both a second set of eyes, so you catch typos and non-standard uses that have not fully entered the language, and it also brings another dose of Sprachgefühl. It's a great German word that means the feel of language, and that's the secret weapon of every working lexicographer. It's the feel of language. An editor presses some standardization into a written work. And for general lexicographers like myself, that helps us know when words have entered into the language. We're trained to enter neologisms only when they've become well established, and how we historically have gauged that is by seeing when editors will let them into printed prose. Now, giving preference to edited sources in the internet age means you lose a huge swath of the English language. You particularly in America lose a lot of dialectal or regional words. This is a good example. This is the word finna. Finna is a verb. It's a contraction of fixing to. It's used primarily in African American vernacular English, what was formerly called Black English, and in a few sub-dialects of Southern American English. But because it's dialectal and it's a contraction, it rarely shows up in the traditional types of sources that lexicographers mark. So you'll see in our own in-house citation database, there are no hits. In Google Books, there are only 3 hits. In COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, no hits. And in COHA, Corpus of Historical American English, there are no hits. Where it does show up, and a lot, is in social media and in pop culture online. So on the right, what you see is a heat map of tweets, public tweets, that use the word finna that were also geographically tagged. There are 40,000 tweets. This is from 2 weeks in 2013. 40,000 tweets used finna. Okay, well that doesn't account for misspellings. So we then move on the left, you see search results from genius.com, which is a site that hosts rap and hip hop lyrics. And there we have over 18,000 results for finna. And that gives us evidence of finna in running text as well, if you look through these things. So you get finna get loose, means I am fixing to get loose, and finna hit a lick, I am intending to rob a liquor store. So these sorts of databases are important to the lexicographer. Of course, corpora have become indispensable to the lexicographer. Everybody here knows that. But they are not replacements for editors, and sometimes they're not even good replacements for reading programs, which is a controversial thing to say here. But I'm American, and we lean into controversy. So the benefit of citation gathering is that it involves an active and attentive search for new words and new senses, and that is exactly what general lexicographers like me are trained to do. And it happens to be a lot of what interests us as we work on updating monolingual English dictionaries. Now, what we do is we have our reading and marking, and we dump that into a variety of different databases in-house. This is a screenshot from one of our older databases, because I couldn't get the screenshot to work on my new computer. And this gives you a sense as to what we're looking for. You will see, I'm going to attempt to, there we go. You'll see down here the sense of burn that refers to saving usually music or data to a CD or a DVD. That's something that we can mark. Once we find a neologism in reading and marking, we then go to the corpora to see how widespread it is, to get a sense of regional spread, to get a sense of commonality. So right now, our current approach is heavily blended. I'll come back to that at the end. So, we have changed the way we gather raw materials. We've changed the way that we handle defining management. This is perhaps one of the biggest issues that we've had to deal with. So during the paper days, this is what a standard defining batch looked like. That is what we call a galley. It is one column of a dictionary page, triple spaced. You inserted definition slips, so usually slips would be clipped to it. You inserted notes to it. You wrote on it in grease pencil. Everybody wrote on it in grease pencil. So down here on the bottom right, you see the date stamps of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 editors who worked on this particular batch. As you can imagine, it's a system prone to a lot of error. Slips fall off, have fallen off. Things get smudged, galleys get crowded, can't read what's on them. When we would send these to typists or compositors, sometimes different people's handwriting was so illegible that we would get, particularly our etymologists' handwriting. So we've had to go through and clean up a lot of our etymologists' handwriting. It's a miracle then that you don't end up with more things like this. This is the word dord. This word appeared in Webster's second New International Dictionary in 1934. It is used in physics and chemistry to mean density, except it's actually not used in physics and chemistry, or anywhere for that matter. Dord is an infamous ghost word. It's a non-existent word. It made it into Webster's second because someone misread, as you can see on the slip down there, the slip for D space or space D, which was an abbreviation for density. Now, Dord came out in 1934. Someone noticed that this was not actually a word in 1939, and we submitted over on the right-hand side a plate change in 1940. That's 6 years that it took somebody to even notice that Dord was not right. Now, in spite of Dord and slips falling off, paper worked pretty decently for us until the mid-90s. We had always sort of piecemealed, mostly on the production side, more electronic lexicography. But as a definer, we worked on paper until the early to mid-90s. The big shift was when we began to work on a brand new ESL dictionary. Suddenly, you could no longer rely on your native sense of simple words like go or do to spot collocation, spot common idiom. None of that made any sense to the way that traditional monolingual English lexicographers were trained. So that was the point at which Merriam-Webster saw the corpus light. We had corpora that we used mostly online for free. We did have a couple of paid corpora that we consulted. And there are plenty of defining systems to choose from. And they're indispensable, particularly in creating ESL dictionaries, because of the way that they display and parse things like collocation, use. This is all makes perfect sense to you people because this is what you do. But at the time that we started doing this, particularly in America, this sort of broader system was relatively new. And when we started writing the Learner's Dictionary and conceiving of it in before my time, I believe, 1994, there was no sketch engine. So we kludged together a bunch of things on our own. We had concordance tools that we had, and we had other data retrieval tools and separate parsing tools and separate output tools. It was a giant, ugly, horrifyingly ungraceful mishmash, but it kind of worked. This is one of the tools that we use, the Corpus of Contemporary American English. We would check that mostly for collocation frequency. And this kludge worked so well, even though it was a massive kludge, that we were sold on going electronic from that point on. Merriam-Webster no longer does paper defining. Now, the benefits of defining management systems are not just for the lexicographer, but they streamline the whole defining and production process. They can prepare files for multiple formats very easily. And when you consider that lexicography in America is commercial, it is not an academic supported enterprise, any opportunity to cut costs is something that publishers love a lot. So any lexicography in America at this point has to be agile and responsive to consumer needs, lest I end up unemployed. So users expect online and digital dictionaries to be updated very, very quickly. That means that slicker and more agile systems are required. Now, we're moving into another phase at Merriam-Webster. So the way that we view the dictionary as data is even changing dramatically. So instead of using flat tagged files, Web 1 kinds of files, as we have done forever, we're moving into defining within relational databases, moving into Web 3.0 at this point. We just skipped Web 2.0. We were all busy writing the Learner's Dictionary at Web 2.0. So what this does is it doesn't just enable us to link data between books and data within books and pull extracts based on metadata very easily, but it also allows us to link extra non-dictionary information. So things like words of the day, or things like blog posts, or usage discussions, or word games. Those sorts of things can be very easily linked, and I'll get to that, why that's interesting in a minute. And it makes it easier to output our definitions for print, web, and mobile without undue contortions from our production staff. Now, production may not seem that interesting, but it's actually very important doing commercial lexicography because you have to be multi-platform, and you have to think in terms of multi-platform. Okay, relational databases. This is common sense to everyone in this room because you are all highly intelligent and tremendously good looking. But this is a far cry from the traditional way that editors have been isolated and insulated in lexicography. In the old days, what happened was the editors only wrote definitions, or only wrote their etymologies, or only researched dates, and that was it. There was a hard and fast firewall around the editorial department. Marketing had its own thing. Production had its own thing. Occasionally, if there were no proofreaders on staff, editors would be pulled into proofreading. Yes, that was a thing that existed. We hired specific proofreaders just to proofread, so editors didn't have to proofread. Now, the collapsing of this division and these firewalls has been a huge boon to our technology. It's really not uncommon at Merriam-Webster now for an editor with any kind of coding savvy to build out scripts to help link together all of our information. So we can build a script that'll tweak our concordance software that enables us to search more thoroughly or more efficiently through metadata. Or we can write new programs entirely that will help take our mobile output and put it through different simulators so that we can see how it's going to look on just about every device we have. These patches and tweaks are actually some of our most powerful tools, which is kind of surprising, but the reason they are is because they're written by and for practicing lexicographers. They give us exactly what we need. And this sort of kludging and this sort of input was never allowed in the pre-electronic days. So that's defining management. The third area of change I want to touch on is defining custom. So much of the defining custom of the 20th century in America was established by Philip Babcock Gove, peculiar and undeniably thorough editor-in-chief of Webster's Third New International Dictionary. Prior to Gove, we had longer encyclopedic entries. So at the top, you'll see this is an entry for Hassan from the Second International, and down below is what Gove came up with for the Third. No encyclopedic definitions. We went from having definitions that were in complete sentences to very pared down single statement definitions. These were championed in theory as being the core and part of objectivity. In reality, they were put in place to save space. The book that Gove was overhauling, the second, was 3,400 pages. And there was no bindery in America in the 1950s that could handle that volume, that size, and print it in one volume. So if you wanted to add more and new words, third, you had to cut a huge amount of stuff from the second. And so the book had to be reduced by over 300 pages. And Gove felt that the single statement definition and trimming what he called in all of our works, the fat, from any definition was the way to do it. So gone were extensive verbal illustrations and author quotations. Pictorial illustrations were gone. Front and back matter were gone. So money tables, colleges and universities, flags of the world. Something called the truncated analytical definition became much more in use. The truncated analytical definition is the use of a root word in the definition of a derivative. So devotee then would be defined as one who is devoted to someone or something. That's a truncated analytical definition. Undefined run-on entries, so entries whose meaning could be easily inferred from both the root word and a suffixal or prefixal entry. Those were run-on. If we could avoid own place entry, we would do it. The concern was space. The mantra became concision and accuracy. This is what lexicographers in America have been steeped in since the 1950s. If information about a word was deemed non-lexical, or even just secondary to the core meaning, it was out. If a word could be run on so that we could avoid own place entry, it was done, because if you put a word at its own place, then it would turn the line. And if it turned the line, it would turn the page. And if it turns the page, we add a whole new folio to the back of the book. And then, here is where the real rubber hits the road. We have to increase the price of the dictionary by $1, and no one will buy it. And you laugh, but that is true. People won't buy a $28 dictionary when they will buy a $27 dictionary. Of course, the production costs of a print dictionary influence editorial policy, though we don't like to say they do. The bar for entering a word was set very high because it cost huge amounts of money to pull an entry out of a dictionary that was already printed. So Dord sat in Webster's second for 13 years after it was discovered. The plate was finally changed in 1947 because the company still had a huge amount of print stock and inventory, and there was no way they were going to pulp hundreds of thousands of dollars of books. So print considerations guided what sort of words have been traditionally entered. For a word to get into the dictionary, it had to be well settled in the lexicon. We couldn't afford to keep recomposing books to add or remove words. Now, of course, digital dictionaries have no hard and fast constraints, and you can change them almost like that. And they're much less expensive to produce than print dictionaries, which means that lexicographers can add more words and work more quickly. Another thing that the digital dictionaries have given us is a much clearer connection to the user, and specifically how they use dictionaries. Now, this sort of extensive data on how dictionaries is used was absolutely inaccessible during print dictionary era. We would have anecdata about how individual people use their print dictionaries only when you ran into them on the street and told them what you did, and they said, oh, I have a dictionary at home that my grandmother gave me for my high school graduation, and that's all you would hear. Sometimes I use it to hold the door open. In general, lexicographers have always created dictionaries with having no sense of how a user uses that dictionary. We have just assumed we're meeting user needs. But now that things are online, we can track everything. We can track which words get looked up and which words don't get looked up. This is a screenshot from one of our tools that tells you what are the top lookups daily. And I can take that all the way down into the thousands. I'm just showing you the top 10 because you really don't care what the 5,000th most popular lookup was. We can see what people type into the search input box. We can see what words people click on with an entry. We can evaluate how long people stay on the page. We can even evaluate where their eyes fall on the page as they scroll. This sort of information is unprecedented, and it gives us a direct line to the user. We also have another direct line to the user in the form of editorial email. Now, I am the managing editor and have been for the last 12 years of editorial email, which means that if people don't like something, people always don't like something, that instead of having to hunt down our postal address and write a letter and find an envelope and find a stamp and walk it to the post, now they click a link and tell me how much they hate our dictionary, or the entry for floor, or any number of things that would surprise you. For perhaps the first time in our company's history, we not only had a direct line to the user, but we had a ton of data that we could suddenly analyze. And as we analyzed the data, we found some interesting things. The first is that people don't use dictionaries the way we assume they do. For instance, the top lookups. This is a sample of what on our website are the most popular lookups. The top lookups are not difficult words. They are not necessarily the newest slang words, but they tend to be simple to intermediate words that have confusing or ambiguous uses. So words like pragmatic and disposition are always in the top 10 lookups. Or they tend to have spelling variants you don't expect, like camaraderie. Camaraderie has a spelling variant of C-O-M-R-A-D-R-Y. It is spelled, I don't spell well aloud, so I have to read it, C-A-M-A-R-A-D-E-R-I-E. Those are the types of words that people look up. There's something else that we noticed in all of our web analyses. So in 2008, after 10 years of writing and about 65,000 cups of editorial coffee, we launched our very first ESL dictionary. We launched it in print, online, and mobile. And to our surprise, we found that a lot of native English speakers used it. Now, how did we know that? Because they would write in to tell us that it was an amazing thing. This new dictionary we wrote was so wonderful, and they love it, and it was so simple to understand. And my job as managing editor of editorial email was to respond to those thousands of people and say, thank you. The Learner's Dictionary is a dictionary intended for adult learners of English as a foreign language. We're glad you're finding it so useful. And they would write back and say, I'm not learning English. I was born in New York, or I was born in Topeka, and I speak English fluently. So they wrote back to tell us they weren't ESL learners. We had a ton of native speakers using our ESL dictionary. So we asked them, all these people who wrote, why are you using the dictionary? Why do you like it? Now, editors would consider this to be crass marketing, pandering, but this is all helping us build better dictionaries. Asking users what they want, what they respond to is not a shameful thing. So according to the evidence that they gave us, what they liked was that the Learner's Dictionary was written in a more idiomatic and clearer style. So vitriol is defined as harsh and angry words. Pretty much every native speaker can understand that. In place of opaque usage notes, we had paragraphs of running text with sentence punctuation, something that every editor at the company had to get used to using again. We hadn't used sentence punctuation and definitions for 60 years. The simpler defining style appealed to a lot of people. There are few truncated analytical definitions in the Learner's Dictionary. One thing in particular that we found native speakers really liked were something that we called supplemental information notes, or SINs. The SINs, which you'll see one at the bottom here, contain cultural information that's very important for ESL learners. So this one is for DSS, which is an abbreviation that expands to Department of Social Services. The SIN reads, in the US, a state's Department of Social Services is usually responsible for protecting children from harmful treatment, helping people to adopt children, and providing advice and support to families and children who need it. It's all incredibly helpful for learners, and it's all incredibly non-lexical. The user desire for more information about words isn't just limited to lexical information about words. People still come to the dictionary for definitions. Most of our traffic still comes for a definition, but once they're there, they click around to other stuff. They click around to the word of the day, or the word games, or the usage discussions. One of our most visited pages on our subscription site for the unabridged dictionary is the entry for asshat, because it has a 300-word etymological note about where the word asshat comes from. And everybody loves finding out where asshat comes from. It turns out in the real world, words don't exist in this beautiful isolation chamber. Now, this information has led to a huge revolution in how Merriam-Webster defines. We do still define in alphabetical batches, because old habits are really hard to break. But one of the things that we do now is we go through our top lookups and we revise those first. We revise those most carefully and flesh them out. We have a user-submitted dictionary on our website that we ask people who have new words that they don't find in the online dictionary to submit. We ask them for the word, we ask them for a definition, a part of speech, an example sentence, and a URL where they have seen it. We slurp that into all of our backend. We jettison their definition and part of speech because they are invariably wrong and terrible, but we mine those URLs and slurp all of those citations to our database now. By tracking what keystrokes happen in the lookup input box, we can not only build an algorithm that helps with spelling matches, but we can also see if there are new words that people are looking up in droves that we don't have, and then we can move very quickly to enter those into the dictionary, particularly if they're words that have some other use. So, for instance, SARS was a word that we entered into the dictionary very quickly when we noticed within a week that a ton of people were looking it up. We had plenty of evidence for it, but just according to traditional publication schedules, we would have had to wait until the following year to enter it. Now we don't have to. We can also cross-reference what people enter and what they look for with our own new words lists. And when it comes to working on actual definitions, we have no space constraints. We can add as many illustrative quotations as we think are helpful. And some of those quotations can have non-lexical information that people find interesting. We can add more sins. And most importantly, now at Merriam-Webster, lexicographers are expected to write all sorts of information. So we all write blog posts. There are only 3 of us who do the videos because we could not, for love of money, give anybody else, push them in front of the camera. I am happy to make a ham of myself. I can totally be a joker. So I'm happy to do that. But everyone is required to write ancillary content now. It is considered part of the editor's job. We have dipped our toe into creating an online community. Just as data is not static, and just as our databases are now relational, so too we are creating a relational experience for the user of the dictionary. We found that users want to engage with the words that they're seeing or they are not seeing. So we started our user-submitted dictionary site. We have opened up comments on entries. That's what you see at the top. We call it seen and heard. So people can share what they think about an entry, why they came to an entry. Sometimes that's for better or worse. This is the seen and heard comment for the word socialism, and the first comment starts with, speaking of poorly formed opinions, and then goes on. I cut it off after 4 lines because you didn't need the other 18, trust me. We're seeing a lot of engagement on social media. So down below, here's someone querying me about an ice hockey question on Twitter that I answered. So instead of seeing users just as consumers of dictionaries, we are seeing them as part of the lexical community that we all live within. And we're using the data that they are giving us to make our dictionaries better. All right, those are the 3 very, very broad overviews. So let's get into some philosophical considerations that we need to ruminate on. The first is, are reading programs a thing of the past? Can we just move to corpora? It would be ludicrous to say that corpora have not been a boon to lexicographers. Corpora fill in gaps that citation databases and reading programs have. That is very, very clear. They help give lexicographers a sense of the regional spread of the word, the relative density of a word's use in academic or in spoken English, the frequency of various senses and collocations. All sorts of metadata is very helpful. Finna, for example, is one of the thousands of words that we would have missed had it not been for corpora. So they give us more words, more granular data. They also give us more access to materials than ever before. So in the dead tree era at Merriam-Webster, if you were defining a specialized term and we had no citations in the house for it, you had to physically leave your desk, which is something that terrifies most traditional lexicographers, and you would have to go to the library and have human interaction and hunt down materials to photocopy for evidence. Or you would have to rely on consultants, generally PhD students or professors at local colleges, who were more than thrilled to share with you everything they knew about their subject area. Again, more human interaction, not something we do well. And those consultants don't write definitions very well, so it was a lot of work. Now, all we have to do is log into any one of the hundreds of corpora that are available. So the scale certainly seems tipped towards corpora for sure. But even the best corpora are no match for a lexicographer in his or her eye. The biggest weakness of existing online corpora is that they're not suited to finding new words or new senses of very common words, and that's the primary duty of lexicographers. In our experience, we have found that a hand-marked citations database is a little bit more effective in targeting those new coinages and subtle lexical shifts. Citations databases are also easier to curate. Sometimes we use corpora and we're not sure what sources they're pulling from. And that sounds kind of silly, but for an American dictionary, we need to know, for instance, are you pulling British sources? Are you pulling Canadian sources? Are you pulling global English sources? The reading program also, you don't have to fix the technical gremlins that show up in any corpora. You don't have to clean a reading program, which is very nice. And furthermore, reading is important primarily to the lexicographer. Even if we found corpora that met all of our needs, reading is still important in keeping your Sprachgefühl well oiled and in use. A lexicographer who doesn't read isn't much of a lexicographer. This keeps you in the language. So, for Merriam-Webster, again, primarily does monolingual dictionaries for native speakers. The way that we're moving forward is a blend of things. We still have a reading program, but we no longer rely on that reading program for all of our sources. We use the corpora to flesh out the reach, the extent, the regional spread, the frequency of those words. As we are working on our learner's dictionary, however, we are finding we are only using corpora for that. So we're using the systems that work best for the dictionary that we're writing. More than citations versus corpora, lexicographers have to grapple with the changing nature of how we communicate and what the record that we leave behind looks like. There was a very spirited discussion in the Web as Corpus meeting yesterday about whether you should clean spam out of a web corpus. Is spam a valid form of communication? So, do edited sources still matter? There are plenty of unedited sources online that are written in completely idiomatic, interesting English. Sometimes they're better written than edited sources. They're also indexed and searchable. So we have a huge treasure trove to mine for coinages. But if we're going to be moving online, we have to devise some new overarching rules for evaluating those sources on a linguistic and, frankly, a legal standard. So, Facebook posts, are they private or are they public correspondence? Are they private correspondence intended for a small group of people, or are they public because of the nature of social media? What do you do with the amazingly prolific Twitter stream of a 12-year-old girl? That is a stream that in the US we cannot legally spider unless we get permission from her parents and the minor and disclose what we're doing with that information. But maybe she is using on fleek so beautifully, and I want that citation. We have to move forward, and we have to think more in a community-based mind. We can't think entirely academically anymore. we want to build a community of users, we have to respect that community and their boundaries, which is a hard thing to suss out online. So there are no easy answers. So if the internet has changed how we handle sources, it's also changed how we handle dictionaries. What do dictionaries look like in the modern era? A broader audience means that the lexicographer has to be flexible, and user response and user interaction should be the thing that drives creation at this point. Jane Solomon, who is here at eLex, and Orion Montoya presented a study at the Joint DSNA Shell Conference in June that examined click sessions on dictionary.com. Look at individual click sessions to see where people went, how they traversed through the online dictionary. It was some really fabulous work, and it included this tidbit that in September, there were 2 pairs that seemed to be looked up a ton. Bastion to hiatus was the first pair, so people would go to Bastion and then navigate immediately to hiatus. And enmity and decorous were the second pair. And they did a little bit of data crunching, and they figured out that all of those words are used in the first chapter of William Golding's Lord of the Flies. So Bastion's on page 14, hiatus shows up on page 15, enmity and decorous are both on page 6. So it stands to reason that if we can spot that pattern, then perhaps what we would like to do is we would like to offer to our readers more Lord of the Flies vocabulary. In addition to looking at how people use the dictionary, we have to think about how that information is presented. There's absolutely no reason for an online dictionary entry to look like or mirror a print dictionary entry. They are 2 separate things. So run-in definitions, that is definitions that were in paragraph form as opposed to different definitions on each line, as they are here. Esoteric etymologies that use a shorthand that I spent years learning and then have not used in 15 years at this point. All of those things should be reevaluated online. If we know, for instance, that based on the lookups, people are looking up words primarily for spelling purposes, then perhaps the head word should be the biggest thing on the page. Merriam-Webster lists its definitions in chronological order. That has always made sense to scholars. It is something that users hate. Users want to see the most frequently looked up sense of any word when they look it up. They don't want to sift through. Specious is not so bad, but words like run or go or do or general are quite long. So at Merriam-Webster in the new unabridged dictionary, where all of our new entries are based on frequency, they are not based on chronological order. All right, let's see if I can, I have to do that before I can do that. Digital aids have to be evaluated. We can verify how the spelling algorithm moves by tracing individual click sessions. How many times do they backtrack and re-enter a word or a new spelling of the word to get to where they need to be? We need to think in terms of accessibility. This is something lexicographers have never had to think about. If you have someone who is visually impaired using your data, then how do you structure it so that reading programs read through it quickly in the best way? We also need to go into a deeper philosophical consideration. If we have no space constraints, then where do we draw the line between lexical and non-lexical information? How much information do we add? Entries like go and do are already huge. Should we really make them any longer? How do you help orient the user in online dictionaries towards the definition that they're looking for, particularly when you have really long entries? So most importantly, we have to reevaluate what a dictionary is in the digital age. Now, an informal survey of the email we get in our office shows people still expect a dictionary is a curated source. We did an experiment a few years ago. If someone looked up a word in our online dictionary that was not entered, but there was an open source dictionary entry for it, we shunted them over there and gave them a little pop-up that said, this word wasn't entered in our dictionary, but here's a user-submitted entry that's been vetted by editors, and people overwhelmingly hate it. People would say things like, if I just want junk, I'll Google it, or I'll go to Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary is a fine source. It's a different thing. So people expect curation still. But people expect more from a dictionary than lexicographers have thought. So the warm reception of SINs and of linked information tells us that people want some non-lexical information to get to a dictionary as well. But we have to draw the line. Print dictionaries have always toyed with what we would consider to be borderline lexical information, so lists of synonyms or extensive etymology notes. But now, with all of our corpora and all of our parsing tools, we can plot the regional spread of a word. We can put it in an n-gram with other related words to show comparative frequency across a corpus. We can even provide people with the raw materials. We can give citations to show what these things are based on. Should we include that? And more importantly, will users use it? We all love that stuff. We're nerds. But do users want that? Nerds are great, by the way. I like nerds. So how do we add and integrate this information into a dictionary without losing the dictionary-ness of the dictionary? Flexibility. As our user base broadens, we have to consider the audience. If I have someone coming to our website who is a native speaker of English, as an adult, native-speaking teenager, and an adult ESL learner in the intermediate level, how do I present information? Instead of demanding that the users meet us, we must meet them. And finally, digital dictionaries are no longer static references. All signs point to editions being a thing of the past. The OED and Merriam-Webster's online unabridged are both currently online only and being constantly reevaluated and updated. Now, this is a sticking point for a lot of academics. They like things that are stable, things that they can refer to. But what we found is that the general user pays no heed, and honestly, dictionaries were never stable even in print. We would release copyright updates every year that would fix things, add new dates of first usage, add some new words. So even when people referred to print dictionaries and thought of them as stable, they never really were. They were never a static thing. But the online dictionary makes it clear that this is a record of an ever-changing language, and it will always be moving. The title of my talk was taken from an excerpt of Samuel Johnson's preface to his dictionary. This is the excerpt. He gives a short and not horribly wrong account of how language moves from oral to written. And you'll see that he implies that reducing what he calls this wild and barbarous jargon involves some approximation. There are a lot of hedges in this statement. So he says, every penman endeavored to express as he could the sounds which he was accustomed to pronounce or to receive. You can see he's trying not to make any straight lines here. But he says these things were vitiated in writing and vitiated in speech. They were corrupted. This is not a sanguine outlook. But the idea of trying to domesticate and put to purpose something that is wild and untamable is a perfect analogy for how practical lexicography wrangles digital abundance. But I think we can be a little bit more hopeful about the outcome than Johnson was, even if we're at a point where our dictionaries feel, as he would say, vague and unsettled. The issues are substantial, but frankly, conferences like eLex and more open communication between academics and practicing lexicographers can only make dictionaries better. They can only provide more, as we provide more information to academics about how users use dictionaries and use corpora and how lexicographers use corpora, you can implement that information into research. So I will end here because I believe I'm done. But thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Kory. We have, of course, times for questions, so please just raise your hand. We have 2 microphones. Milos and I will be... Okay, Ilan, you can...
Thank you, Kory. 2 questions. One is, you were saying, how do we keep the dictionary-ness of the dictionary? Why should we? And secondly, about this citation from Samuel Johnson, he's talking about language being mainly oral, but isn't today language becoming more and more, if not mainly, written? I know lots of people who don't want to talk to me. They prefer email and all kinds of stuff like that. Thank you.
Well, I can't say whether language is primarily oral or written these days because that's a linguist thing and I'm not a linguist. I'm just a slob that writes definitions. I can say that we are as a lexicographer, I think we're in an interesting point where a lot of what we would previously have considered private communication, letters or notes to each other, are now public. So people have Twitter feeds, Snapchat, WhatsApp, all of these apps that are public, but still directed at a community of people and still, in many places, viewed as private. There are a huge number of private locked Twitter accounts, and those people are using it primarily as a letter writing or a note writing service. So I think that what we can say is that I would still argue that most language creation is still oral. Slang gets created in the moment, gets passed around between a user community. And even slang that moves online or is created online still has oral use. So this is a great example. There is a abbreviation in America, AF, that is short for as fuck. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone. You're not American, so I can say that and nobody will care. But it's a way of saying, so he is hot AF. Well, I thought it was hot AF. My 15-year-old daughter informs me that it is AF, hot AF. So why is it hot AF, but it's not OMG? It's like, oh, Mom, that's horrifying. It's OMG, it's not OMG. So clearly, so this is still oral. We're still using words orally. So I'm now saying things that I don't have any expertise in, so I'll do that. Should we keep the dictionary-ness of the dictionary? That's an excellent question. I think it's clear people want more what we would have considered non-lexical information. I think the question is, what do people want and what will people respond to? Because you have so many different users of a dictionary. And even though we get people who want SINs and who want usage discussions, expanded etymology notes, and they want all of this extra stuff that we've been trained to trim out, I still get people who, when I tell them I work at Merriam-Webster, tell me they refuse to use Webster's third New International Dictionary, a dictionary that came out in 1961, and they only use the second, a dictionary that came out in 1934, because Webster's has ruined the language. We've become permissive. We've included impact as a verb in our dictionaries, and the world is falling all to hell because of us. So there's a very broad opinion of what is appropriate in a dictionary. I think there's no easy answer to figuring out how do we keep a dictionary, like what's going to separate a dictionary from an encyclopedia. I think that's something that we have to reckon as we move forward and we have more data at our disposal to use.
Milos?
Hi, I'm Megan Hall from Oxford University Press in South Africa. I'm asking you as another practical lexicographer, how do you run your reading program? How do your various team members take part? How do you manage it? And secondly, if you have time, how do you measure workload if people are not only working on entries? So if they're doing blogs and they're doing Twitter and they're doing 65 other things, it's very easy to measure workload when you say you've got to do 200 entries in a week or whatever.
Right.
How do you do it otherwise?
Right. The reading program is the easier question to answer, I think. We have an editor on staff who part of their job, in addition to writing definitions, is to run the reading program. They help curate a reading list for people, and we have a list of sources and types of sources that we consistently mark and print. And when the editor in charge of the reading program comes by your desk and sees you staring off into the middle distance, she puts the list in front of you and says, choose a couple of sources to read and mark and get that, let's do that now. So our reading and marking program is still curated. We actually have editorial meetings once a quarter to discuss the effectiveness of the program. But we do have one editor who's in charge of curating that program and making sure that people are reading and marking, which is helpful because you have to make time to do it. A lot of people assume that it's something you do at the end of a defining day as a way to relax, and it can't be. It has to be an intentional read. Measuring workload has been hard because, of course, no deadlines ever move. Everyone's deadline is always yesterday. What we have done is what we've said is, now our defining staff is only about 30 editors, so much smaller than Oxford's defining staff across the world. What we do is we say we work backwards from a deadline, and we go through every bit of production that needs to be done. So we say we have a release deadline for October. Cold reading will be done these weeks. Then we go back and say pronunciation must be done by this point. Etymology must be done by this point. Cross-reference must be done by this point. So we are still given weekly deadlines. So when I go back and I land, I will immediately begin work on my weekly deadline because I have not done any work this week. And that's okay. But we do still have weekly deadlines, and we do still have people are evaluated by batch. But it is difficult because, of course, then these extra needs, these ancillary needs come up in the moment. If there's a lookup that's spiking and someone wants me to write a blog post about it, I can't say, I'll get back to you in 3 days when I'm done with my defining batch. So that is something that we're always trying to feel our way through as well, in terms of what's the need from marketing, or what's the need from production, or what's the need from digital. But we do still, at this point, use defining deadlines as our main way of evaluating workload.
Okay, yeah, I have a question. Thank you. My name is Thierry Declerc from German, Institute for Artificial Intelligence. You were mentioning corpora as a source of information for your language gathering. And I bet this is a raw corpora running text. There are also many now online annotated corpora, and also a huge amount of more or less professional lexical sources. I was thinking WordNet, for example, for English.
Right.
Is this the kind of thing you're also starting to use or to refer to? Cross-link to these kind of resources?
We are, though we do that primarily in-house, and it's not something that ends up being evident in the data that gets presented to the user. What we actually have, oh my goodness, I don't know how many links, but we have sort of a list in-house of approved corpora, which is always, again, being evaluated and is pretty broad. So for instance, genius.com, which is a user-submitted website for song lyrics, is one of our approved corpora, as is Coca and Koha, and as is 1010. So all of these things that so all of these corpora can be pulled. You can pull from any of those corpora as you're defining. What must be done as we define in the database is you need to list which corpora you've used so that we know that you're using a balance of corpora. And you also need to give relative hits within that corpus. What we like to do as well is our own citational database, while not a proper corpus because it's not full text, we do have that in a database, and that is always sort of the baseline of what we have. So, and that, of course, is not just informed by the reading program anymore. That's informed by the user-submitted submissions. We do spider a few websites and pull them into our citation database. We pull things from emails that are sent to us, URLs that we read, URLs that users submit. So it's a pretty, we've really moved into a very broad, I mean, considering that we really had one source until the early 90s, we've really moved into as many broad sources. I feel like it's best to give a very broad sweep, pull from a broad sweep.
Okay, we don't have time for any more questions. Sorry.
Sorry.
we have to wrap up. There's a coffee break in the dining hall. Thank you again,
Thank
Kory,
you.
for this wonderful talk.
Thank you, everyone.